Right, good evening and welcome to the finals of phase. Hello, guys. Hello. A quick one before we start the final. Please, when the debate is going on, we need you guys at the back to keep quiet so that what is going on can be heard by everybody. Okay? And please, limit the movement, the desk, the door, everything, please. All right. Good evening again and welcome to the finals of Face of the Kumasi Open. In today's debate, we have in opening government team Ahodwo, Andrews and Ralph. We have in opening opposition team Bantama, Joel and Grifiths. We have in closing government team Kent, also known as Kentikrono. That is Franco and Joel. And then in closing opposition, team Adum, Brain and Martina. The motion for this final is this House will criminalize climate change denial. At this point, I'll hand over to the panel chaired by Erasmus, and then he will coordinate the final. Thank you very much.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This House would criminalize climate change denial. So panel, before I proceed with my speech, we need to understand what this debate is about, right? So we need to understand the context of this debate and where we should place all our arguments in our speeches. And for that reason, I'll give you 5 framings to this, and also I'll give you 2 arguments and why we should win today's debate, right? So panel, when we say this House, who is this House, right? This House must be a government because only government have the ability to criminalize activities within their jurisdiction, unlike international organizations who don't have the power to criminalize such activities, right? 2, it is the government that have the mechanisms and the machineries like the police system, the police service, the court systems, and the military to enforce these laws that will be made. 3, this criminalization means that anybody who denies the climate change verbally or engage in the activities that in any way or form ignore the existence of climate change and the threat of this and the threat of this is equally and tantamount to a non-verbal denial of climate change, which would be prosecuted as a criminal offense and will be heavily punished based on the extent of damage caused. The fourth framing to this debate is that this debate is placed in developing countries, and I'll show why. Because A, there is massive shift of heavy pollution industries from the West and China to these developing countries, which has made the carbon concentration in these countries increase sharply. B, the effect of these companies on the environment is not only limited to carbon production, right, or atmospheric pollution. It extends to the tangible negative effect on the water bodies and the lands that many people in these developing countries depend largely on for livelihood through agriculture, drinkable water, etc., right? This is causing irreparable health damages and long-term negative effects. C, these countries, because of their cheap labor and their relaxed economic laws and enforcement mechanisms, have made them a breeding ground for mining companies that do not prioritize environmental protection laws and enhance concentrated pollutions in these countries. The fifth framing to this debate. We are going to criminalize it by parliamentary legislation, and this is what you should understand. And this would work because there's already a public outcry in these countries like Ghana on galamsey and pollution. On Ghana and galamsey and pollution it is causing, and Congo and the pollution that these mining companies are causing. This means politicians are much inclined to criminalize these things based on the public pressure that they are giving them. Panel, you should know that these people are the ones that voted these politicians to parliament, and based on these principles and based on the issue of you having this power to solve these problems that we have. That's why they send them to parliament, and that's why we are using that channel to criminalize this position. The argument are as follows. First argument: these countries have very little resources to deal with the negative externalities of climate change, hence must take very drastic actions in all ways to prevent the exacerbation of the threat that climate change poses in these countries. This is a self-defense of a state. This is a self-defense of the state involved for the survival of their people and their perpetuity. Second argument: we are criminalizing it. We are criminalizing it because criminal activities are considered activities that are harmful to everyone within that state and not just one person. That is why it is the state that prosecutes criminal charges. It means we are justified to criminalize any act that represents climate change denial because the harms directly or indirectly affect everyone within that state and retard national progress. I take you.
So does criminalizing mean that you are going to give them the platform to mount defense for themselves?
Very well. Panel, we prove to you that we are using this because we believe that government have all these essential things that they are talking about, like the police service, the judicial, and everything, who will take precedence of all these things. The reason why we are criminalizing this with the parliament is because they are the people who make laws. We are talking about the tangible effect, the tangible negative effect which this climate change has on the environment, and that's why we are using this to criminalize them, right? So that's what we get. So what do you get entirely from my speech? Panel, you get 5 framings to why we are going to use the government to criminalize these activities, because it is the government who has the right to make these laws and also who have the right to protect its citizens and also those who are in the state, right? Because we are talking about survival and perpetuity, right? We are talking about a state which has, for a very long and large extent, has allowed all these things to come out, right? And there's a public cry from the people, and these people are the ones who are enforcing the parliamentarians to take these actions so that you will cut off the harms and the negative effects that climate change has on the country. You get the argument for me that these countries are countries which has very small or little resources to combat the negative harms that later come on this country, right? So if these countries don't take the drastic or the harsh measures that will solve this problem, the generation that is coming after will be people who do not have good health, because originally or existentially, these countries do not have all the resources or the health facilities that will curb this problem that this climate change is bringing. For this clarity and argument, you have no way to please us.
Okay, so panel. Okay, this house would criminalize climate change denial. The only problem we have with the multi-layered framing we get from opening government is one about setting a debate in developing countries. We don't think that you get a fair argumentation primarily when you only set this debate in developing countries who engage that. But principally, we think that there is no incentive for the kind of aggressive denial OG needs for their 5-layered framing to work. We don't think that people have so much incentive. We don't think that there's so much denial that warrants this kind of aggressive action in developing states. But principally, we also think that these problems of climate change that have been caused by industries, etc., as they would preach, Galamsey, etc., have been mostly things that are substantiated from the inaction and ineffectiveness of the state in and out of itself to enforce laws. We saw Galamsey, etc. They didn't do anything about it. We don't think that that would be a fair place setting for this debate.
Would you decriminalize tests when people stop stealing, like, or there's a few number of people stealing?
Would we decriminalize?
Decriminalize theft when there's a few number of people stealing?
We'll answer that later. But why is that important in today's debate? Why are they justified to do so? Why does OG think that they are justified? They say that, well, there's very little resources to curb the harms that climate change has. They say that it causes harms to everyone, and then they are justified. We show them why the end result of the very problem that they state, the concept of climate change, is not solved by merely criminalizing these actions, and we don't think that it provides like any kind of world in that like regard. But what particularly is important in today's debate is one thing, is the narrative autonomy. The question of what climate change denial is simple. Everybody knows what climate change denial is. But the question is, what does climate change denial really looks like? Climate change denial really looks like people who do not think in the first place that climate change exists. But secondly, it looks like people who do not think that the concept and the principle of climate change is as urgent as people believe it to be. We don't think that you get a lot of coverage when you actively like criminalize people who have substantiated beliefs on A, it does not exist, or B, it exists, but it's not as dangerous as it seems. Panel, there are alternatives to all this world. Some of these alternatives in even developing countries, in the context that he sets, are like governments taking better, effective actions against direct like harms that are being caused, etc. You have identified the problem. It's galamsey. It's certain human activities. What are you doing about those activities? How has that failed to the extent that you need to put certain drastic actions that is like making people go against certain things that they would believe in principle, right? But what is most important in today's debate is just one thing, narrative autonomy. What does this look like? Panel, the thing about climate change is that there's always been room for discussion around climate change. What is climate change? When did it start? Do we think that it will end? There's always been that kind of discourse around the concept of climate change. We think that discourse around every social need is very important. What you do when you criminalize climate change is that you leave room, you create a precedence where there is no room for interrogation. What that means is that people cannot interrogate the concept of climate change. People cannot bend on the belief to say that does climate change exist? Is it as urgent as we think? We don't think that you allow discourse in a world where climate change needs that kind of discourse. But secondly, what you do when you create that kind of state versus individuals or state versus non-climate change activism groups is that you create an unfair competition where these people cannot win. Because the best that you can do when you are like engaging in this form of activism is that you are going to be criminalized. What that leaves in Gav's world is a world where there is no check or there's no question on accountability. Because what it looks like is that the moment you start to question the government on what is climate change, what does it do, what are you doing about climate change, those things could be warranted or precedented to the concept of climate change denial. We don't think that there's any check on states. We don't think that there's any check on the concept of climate change, particularly when you say that you criminalize any form of denial, etc., whether verbal or active propagation. We don't think that you get that kind of interrogation A or that kind of accountability too. Secondly, on principle, is that what you do is that you coerce parties to actively engage in climate change activism, that is i.e. for climate change, even like when it goes to their own disadvantage. When people do not believe in climate change, we feel like they have that express ability to express that. We think that that kind of interrogation is very important. But panel, understand, like on the second layer of framing, that the biggest problem that climate change faces is people that are actively going into like things that go against the environment. But the second problem, the second biggest harm to climate change is not only human actions, but it's the denial of climate change. Why does aggressively attacking the second part, what is the denial aspect, very wrong? It's because of the concept of the public element. What you then do is that what you then do when you criminalize climate change and the concept of climate change is that you give people who are against climate change the opportunity to say that we think that government is abusing our rights because we believe in A. We think that government is going against us because we believe in B. Why particularly is that wrong? It's because you create that kind of traction for anti-climate change bodies to say that, oh, we are not being fairly treated, etc. But why that is more important is that you create more attention to the concept of anti-climate change. Then people start to ask questions like, what have these people done to warrant this kind of...
Do you believe in terrorism?
We believe in terrorism as and when it is necessary to the concept of this debate. You can bring that when you come. Panel, in extensions, we believe that you draw attention to anti-climate change. You allow people to ask discourse on the negative when you should be accentuating the positive. What climate change means is an accentuation of the positive. This is what is happening to our world. This is how we solve it. That's the only way you can clamp down the idea of the denial of climate change. But secondly, we think that a system that bases its relevance on like sentimental argumentation that, oh, the world is coming to an end, everybody should do this, otherwise we'll punish you. We don't think that that kind of sentimental argumentation is what will like convert people that are in the concept of climate change. What you need is people that live in the denial of climate change to exist in a world where they believe that climate change actually exists. Climate change can be big and industrial as OG preaches, but we also believe that the concept of harming things in climate change also exists in the very minute things we do. It looks like mothers cooking with charcoal and coal when they could use gas. It looks like very simple things. What you need from these fundamental people who do actions that warrant like the denial of climate change is for every single person in his very simple way, in his very small way, to actively start doing things that would be like particularly good for like the environment. Why do we think that alternatives exist? And these alternatives are very important. But we think that alternatives, such as investments by these developing countries into greenhouses, investments into things that are more sustenance, things that are more tangible to save our society, is precedent to criminalization. They don't show us how these developing states have been the first place, put measures out that have not worked to the extent that there needs to be this thing. Secondly, is a need for ecological policies and the enforcement of these ecological policies by these very developing states. What people need is an incentive to be really educated on the concept of climate change. Proud leader of opposition.
So I'm starting my speech. Now. CEO asked the POI that when you criminalize this, you still give them the platform to go to court and defend themselves, etc. First, that POI is useless because the fact that criminals can go to court and mount a defense have never been a reason to criminalize, to not criminalize an act when we identify that it's bad. Secondly, we think that the kind of legislation we are pushing for is a very extreme one. It means that when we catch you in any act that falls under the scope that we give you, we are going to jail you. At worst, at best, we are going to expel you from the country if that's the softest punishment you get. So we think that's better on our side without saying that, oh, they'll go to court and they'll go and win all of those things. You need to defend why the criminalization shouldn't exist, not that the criminalization can exist, but those people can go and debate their way in court. Clarity from Deputy Prime Minister. One, and that's the question this guy asked, because what Ralph told you was why developing countries should be the focus. What he didn't tell you then was why it cannot be developed countries, and I'm going to give you two pragmatic reasons why. One, because the developed world have started shutting down heavy pollution plants and companies, as Biden did with the executive order on his first day of presidency. What this did was to force a lot of these heavy pollution companies to relocate to the African countries or to the developing countries that have weaker legislations. He says, oh, the problem is weaker legislations. What we are then doing is to strengthen those legislations to make sure that we don't give them that safe haven that they come to get on our side. And that's the reason why these guys lose the debate. But secondly, we think that these developed countries realistically have massive resources and better infrastructure to mitigate the negative effects of climate change better than these developing countries. What this means is that the urgency that Ralph describes to you that exists on the side of developing countries, for which reason we call for this criminalization, cannot be said same for these developed countries. And that's the reason why we don't think the criminalization or the urgency or the scope of impact can be same. So we classify both of them and say, the framing was narrow and all of those things. You need to be realistic. From OG, we agree. Our definition of climate change denial is very extreme and likely unfair, but we justify it with the grave urgency that exists and the kind of mismanagement that these guys push on their side. We don't care whether you think it's fair or not. We think that we save lives on our side, and that's what I'm going to show you. Opening opposition says three things. One, they say there's not so much denial in developing countries. Why are they saying that? One, because the kind of denial they are looking for is the verbal open denial. But it's true. In developing countries, you don't find a lot of the verbal denial. But what you find is the non-verbal denial, which is the act itself. of ignoring climate change and polluting the environment. The reason why this is far more dangerous is because those are the ones that have far more tangible impact on the society rather than somebody standing on the podium and merely denying it. We think that the denial that exists in developing countries is far more pernicious and pervasive. We need to criminalize it. Secondly, they say state inefficiencies and are the problem and not climate change denial. So we are using the law to enhance the state solvency mechanisms. And so if you are talking about state inefficiency, we are dealing with it on our side. Thirdly, they say, let's invest into green tech. Two responses. One, a lot of these developing countries don't have the resources needed to invest in very heavy and very costly green tech. So what's the alternative? To force corporations to do it on their behalf before they come to their side. And this criminalization is what's going to force corporations that come down to make sure that they have green tech or safer means of exploiting their resources before they come down. We better those things on our side. First analysis you get from Ralph is why there can be verbal forms of denial. And I'm going to show you why we're going to criminalize that one and criminalize the non-verbal ones too. One, because the verbal forms can be done by two entities. Mostly can be done by politicians who have massive followers and audience that drive actions through their speech. What this does is to breed a lot of grounds for opposition to the consensus that is needed to drive anti-climate change denial actions within those particular states. We think that we'll criminalize any form of verbal speech by politicians in that regard because they are anti the progress that we seek. Secondly, denial by individuals, when we catch you, are going to criminalize it. Why? Because it's tantamount to publicly endorsing things like xenophobia, attacks against your own people, and endorsing acts that go a long way to antagonize the very survival of the people that you are supposed to live with. We think that those are criminal in nature, and we are going to criminalize them. Secondly, the non-verbal ones. And those are the most popular ones in these developing countries. Why? Because no company says it in the open that we don't care about climate change. But what they do is to clearly show it in their actions by not prioritizing safer means and ignoring all the climate change mechanisms that, even though may seem weak, even to the barest minimum, may have worked. What we've now realized is that we need very pronouncing and drastic means to be able to drive the kind of change that we are talking about. Why is this important? Because one, actions speak louder than words. Even though they are not saying it out loud, their actions have more tangible impact. We think that's the biggest kind of endorsement that we need to be able to the biggest kind of evidence that we need to be able to criminalize and prosecute them. But secondly, they cause more tangible harm than even verbal ones, because those are the ones that pollute the environment. At least the verbal one has a likelihood of driving a few people, but non-verbal and tangible ones are the ones that pollute the waters, deny farmers the kind of quality land that they need to survive, and antagonize the very agrarian economy that a lot of these countries are built on. You are dying, you are killing these countries slowly, and we think we need to criminalize them. But third argument in my speech is that there is implicit culpability of the state on their side, because they keep on saying that the state is not doing enough. Exactly what we are saying, that this time round the state should criminalize it as the biggest statement of all. Why is this important? Because if the state doesn't, they are complicit in the very atrocities that are being committed against their people. And so in that regard, what we are doing as a state then is to absorb ourselves from that culpability, but secondly, defend the kind of people that we ought to defend as government in that regard. But finally, these actions only benefit the few rich people, like Galamsey in Ghana. They only benefit the few rich people. Why is this true? Because to a large degree, the kind of corporate social responsibilities that these corporations are supposed to do to mitigate their harms, they don't do it. Newmont, after polluting and destroying all the mountains in New Abram, never went there to refix them as their corporate social responsibility. What they went to do is to build one cheap public school and says we are performing corporate social responsibilities. What this means is that corporate social responsibility as a mechanism of mitigating these harms has never been effective because they've never been proportional in that regard. We need a far more mechanism that endorses the kind of proportionality that we seek. But secondly, these actions enlarge the poverty and inequality systems that exist within these countries, which are the very bedrock of the kind of economic policies that these countries want to enact. If you want to save these countries, side with opening government.
So, before I move on to my case, let me make this clear. The fact that states allowed corporations to settle in their states in the first place when they knew that when they move to developed countries to developing countries, they are going to cause climate change, but yet allow them to come and settle, is a form of climate change denial. because actions speak louder than words. You know that when they come, they are going to cause climate change. Yet you allow them to come and cause this climate change, but then say that, hey, we don't want to be culpable for letting them come, so we are going to criminalize them. We think that's a lazy approach. We think that's culpability on the side of the state. You shouldn't criminalize them for that. We think that if you can solve the problem, solve it, rather than try to actually shift blame on these kind of corporations, right? The silliest thing you will get in today's debate is what you get from closing government. Their POI says that, do we believe in terrorism? Do we think that when small people panel, we think that the whole idea of people stealing is that, see, society is structured around discourse. What this means is that society has accepted that when you steal something, it is bad because they understand the impact of stealing. The reason why this is not seen for climate change is that a set of society does not understand the impact of climate change. That is why they deny it. That is why they don't believe it. So that discourse in itself is not there. You don't have a right to criminalize them because part of society do not understand. That's silly. We believe in terrorism, but we think that when people don't understand something, you should give them room to debate it out. You shouldn't actually clamp upon that kind of right. But then they say that, see, understand also that non-verbal denial in developing countries is a way of life. Because, see, these people cannot win today's debate because they say that we will criminalize non-denial. On the side of corporations, that's not the debate. You are going to criminalize non-denial, whether it is citizens. If citizens do it, you should do it. But then their whole argument was on corporations. We think that the way of life of developing countries is such that they use coal, which contribute to carbon emission, to actually cook and all of those kind of things. It's their way of life, right? But then when you say that, see, we are going to criminalize you, you are forcing them to go green. We think that you can't force someone to go green when they can't afford it. In developing countries, these states are not providing these kind of things for them or even improving their standard of living for them to actually accept it. It means that in villages, they should be using gas to cook. But then what happens when they can't afford these gases? You actually enfranchise them. We think principally that is unjust. I'm not thinking. So, why do we win today's debate, right? New things from me to support Joel. First, in principle, it is not just. Why? First, this is a lazy approach by governments in solving a problem. The problem is climate change. How can we solve it if it's corporations that are moving and causing these kind of things? Stop them from coming. If they are actually doing this already, then if it is social corporate responsibility, hold them to that task. If they destroy the forest, hold them to that task that they should go and rebuild it because the state has the power to do so. They are not doing it. We will criminalize them. That is a lazy approach. Instead of government to this counter solution, re-education, right? Continuous education of the masses. Because we don't think that it's only on corporations. Corporations know that climate change exists, but some people in society don't know. That is why they still live in their way of life. So you should continuously educate them to actually know that yes, climate change is real. Then you open up discourse because discourse already can only exist in our world. Discourse cannot exist in your world because they say that when you talk about climate change and you say that it does not exist, you are going to jail. We think that in itself prevents discourse. Discourse only happens in our world. When there is discourse, people then accept that yes, it is true. Then we should change our style or ways of living, right? But then secondly, right, we think this is a form of coercion on the part of the state. Because see, something is fishy. State is saying that climate change exists. Citizens are saying it does not exist. Instead of state to educate them and let them buy into the whole concept, you are trying to coerce them to buy into the concept rather than educating them to buy into it. We think that in itself is bad. That is coercion, right? The better way to do it is when you educate them to actually buy into that rather than coerce them to do that, right? It doesn't solve any problem because, see, you say that you are going to criminalize them. When you criminalize them, they go to jail and come back. They feel that we don't understand why climate change still exists, so we are going to do it again. You are going to put them in jail again. That is not solving the problem. That is actually coercing people to buy into your ideology. That in itself is something that is bad, right? But then secondly, it's on how society is structured on discourse, more on CG, right? See, things like theft and terrorism has been accepted by society that when these things happen, it can hurt us, right? All society agree. The reason why people go to jail because of theft is because society all know that theft is bad, but then you go on to do it. So it is justified for the state to actually what? Put you away. In climate change, in the case of climate change, not a lot of people actually know. Hey, we don't trust the government because government says that climate change, I'm not taking POI, stop. Please, government says that climate change is real. But then understand that we have seen that big corporations have actually like pocketed like researchers to actually like make research that climate change does not really exist and all of those kind of stuff. We don't trust government because corporations are saying it doesn't exist. Governments are saying it exists, right? We don't think that in itself is right. Society is structured in such a way that they should agree before they move on, right? Climate change is a gradual process. It should be a way of life in developing or developed countries. We think that the debate does not only happen in developing countries, it should be same for developed countries. So if you say that climate change is bad for developing countries, it should be bad for developed countries. You should be able to prove why it should be in developing countries more than developed countries, because we are still experiencing the same impact of climate change, right? But then secondly, coercion is not sustainable to the solution of climate change. Why? Because you will put people and coerce them without making them appreciate the whole concept of climate change. When you don't appreciate it, you don't solve the problem. Make people appreciate it. The solution is simple. Educate them, right? How will you educate them? By employing the mass media, social media, no powerful people. You said that political people are very powerful with their speech. Use your speech to educate the people for them to buy into it. Use religious leaders to actually educate them to buy into it. We don't think you should criminalize it. We think you should educate them. We don't think you should coerce them. We think that you should allow this cause for them to buy into it. Proud to win from Opoku.
Starting now in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in this final, only one team can win. The team that you should consider for the trophy in your deliberation is the team that is able to accept their burdens and defend it. One, the team that is able to engage all the nuances that can exist in the motion, and the team that is able to show you a better way how we are able to tackle the issue at hand here, right? 3 clarifications as to why the opening half cannot be considered in that particular deliberation. One, in that they are focused on like the causes of climate change and not necessarily the principle as opposed to defend, which is the denial of climate change. I'll give you much more clarity on that. But secondly, we think that they focus like their debate in the place setting, right? The reason why that's necessarily problematic is this. One, in that climate change denial is a global phenomenon, right? It even exists more in the places where they didn't have the debate, like it's like in the West and in Europe, right? But the third thing is that the reason why this particular characterization is true and you should consider it in your deliberation is the fact that the effects or the harmful effects of climate changing of themselves, right? It's a global like harm, and so everybody like is able to suffer these particular things, right? Why is this particular clarity important? It means that at the end of the debate, we are supposed to give you a justification from our side of the house why governments existing like in all spaces should be able to take an action against the denial of climate change. Not just government that exists in like in one particular place in the world, but even if you are able to get a global consensus by the way of the UN, so that the ICC can try people who are even doing this, we are very proud to propose such a word in that particular regard. Let me engage who. So they give us 3 particular cases, right? So one, few people are denying this. Panel, that these particular things are false. But even if few people are denying, that the mere fact that there is a harm that is being caused to not just people, but then to the state, right? That we have the authority to be able to do this, and that's why in the POI we ask them. So if stealing goes down, would you like decriminalize it? They are not able to answer it because we think that in principle, when something has a harm, you must criminalize it. It's not really dependent on the number of people that are causing it. But secondly, they say that, well, when people do this thing because they believe in it, the POI on terrorism looks like this. People engage in terrorism because they have beliefs and they are propagating those particular beliefs. If governments and states fight against terrorism, we think that particular belief is questionable or because of the harms. And if you're able to show that this particular belief of denying like climate change, if it's questionable, then you must criminalize it in that particular instance. They say that, oh, this particular thing is not equally accepted, right? That states must take action that would protect the people, and states must take action that would ensure its own continuity. So we don't care if people don't believe in that. The mere fact that we must be, if there is a harm that we are able to prove, it means that we must curtail this. It's not really about the people, but most importantly, on principle, the people have voted the government in power to protect their interests and to protect them in that particular instance. The government has every legitimacy to act on their behalf, particularly when they are not going to make the right choice like these guys say, right? So the alternative, and then they give alternative. Well, you can like have eco policies, you can like convert to green technology and all those things. All of these as a result of like the bad engagement you get from them on their courses and not really which is the heart of the debate. All those particular things can happen like in our world, but you can pursue eco policies, you can do all of those things, and these things are intrinsically happening, right? But the biggest problem against the fight of climate change is there are people who deny these particular people. I'm going to characterize these people to you, right? So I'm going to characterize these particular people to you. So who are these people, right? That these particular people, they are two folds of people, right? We have one people who, because they feel that they want to contribute to science, right? They actually propagate and prop up theories to be able to counter the existence of the climate change theory, right? But secondly, there are businesses who, because of how violating eco policy and all of those things, would give them some sort of like gain. These particular people equally preach the narrative that you people equally like deny the existence of climate change in effect, right? These at the core of these particular people are selfishness, right? Selfishness because of one, the mere fact that they want to be mentioned that they've actually contributed to science, but secondly, selfishness on the part that they want to reap a profit, right? But thirdly, why do they do this? Let's see why.
So we believe that denialists at the core believe that those they do not exist on any means. It's not that they believe that they exist, but find the best incentive for like researchers to say that.
So I'm going to engage like that's the practically our stance, right? But most importantly, not these particular people exist in several places. They look like authors, they look like researchers. These people propagate these things through like books that they write, like articles that they write. They even teach like their followers and audience a lot of those things. These are things that you don't get an engagement, right? What is our stance in what is our stance like in relation to this? Panel, we think that from us, we deny that climate change is even a thing, right? But panel, most importantly, we are going to show you why, even though like it is false, we must propagate that it exists, and then we must propagate that it is there, and we must make sure that nobody is able to counter that particular thing. This is the theory of climate change, right? The theory of climate change posits that the world needs like an average like condition to exist within, and that particular average is something that is important for us. So in a world where that particular thing is breached, it means that all of us can die, and or like living will be hell for us in the earth, right? It means that, but then how do we engage this? There's constant conscientization by states, like by people, like by activists, and even by other relevant bodies to make sure that a lot of people buy into this particular idea. Whether it's true of us, we don't care. That is principally justified for us to defend such a model, right? But what does this mean? It means that we want to create a world where people are wary of their actions. So, for example, you are going to choose between like the coal that you used to cook to eat, and then like your life and the life of your generation who are going to suffer because of using that coal. It means that you are more likely going to like consider an alternative. But secondly, states of themselves are actually propagating a world where they are making some of these green technology like accessible to all of these things. Activists are doing the same in that particular instance, right? But most importantly, what does denial of climate change mean in today's debate? It means that there are people there, as the state is trying to socialize people to buy into that particular concept, which is going to ensure that we have like we sustain the future of the world. There are people who are creating a different chain of socialization, telling people that no, it is false. Like actually creating a new chain of socialization in that particular instance. This means that it's an attack on the state, was an attack of like the goodwill of humanity, and we need to stop this particular thing. That we criminalize things on two fronts. They engage like harm to people. I'm going to engage harm to state. On harm to state, we need to the extent where states are doing like actions to ensure the perpetuity and continuity of like their citizens. It's very much illegal for people to equally preach differently, right? But now, how do we solve this problem, right? So that's to answer their plan. Two things happen in prosecution, like when you criminalize this thing. When we lose, it means that when you lose prosecution, what is how the court case like look like? It looks like one, a lot of evidence is coming to being laid bare. It looks like two, these particular people spending a lot of resources. What does that mean? It means that we decapacitate them from actually getting us like more money to be able to spread their books and spread their theologies. But secondly, notice how there is a sense of like much more court cases not based off like it's a serious process that people are not willing to engage in it. In our world, when we criminalize these things, even in the worst case scenario where there is prosecution, even if we lose the case, the persistent prosecution is one that ensures that much more people are disintensified. But in the world where we win the cases, most importantly, there's incarceration, there's rehabilitation, where we're able to bring these people back to accept the reality and the model that you are proposing. At the end of the day, you need to engage the team and declare the winner, the team that engages all that exists in the motion. Proud to be.
So, panel, we believe that climate change is a very, very important topic, right? We believe that there's a lot that we need to be able to address, right? We think that the kind of solution that these guys bring forward is one that doesn't really solve the problem. We think it's a very, very soft line of argumentation. It doesn't solve the problem, right? What we think from closing opposition is that we need more drastic measures to be able to solve the problem of climate change. We need to go all out. We need radical stances to ensure that climate change
is out, right? We also believe that the idea of choice, the idea that people need to be able to choose to go green and all those things, has existed for far too long. There's a need for us to be able to read that kind of idea from people. There's a need for like governments all around the world, global community, global bodies and all those things, to be able to take active decisions to ensure that they eliminate climate change, right? So, panel, first of all, like, what does denial really mean? Because these guys try to tell us what denial isn't, right? Because denial is a clear, conscious effort to believe that something doesn't exist. Like, even if people tell you with proof and all those things, you still think it doesn't exist no matter what. The reason why corporations and all those things do not form part of climate change denial is because these corporations believe that it exists. They only do things to front that they are going green. That is why Nike will produce just 500 shoes to say 500 eco-friendly shoes and still produce a billion other shoes that go a long way to affect the environment. These companies are not denialists. They are just people who believe, but just front the idea of being climate change people, right? But panel, one must also a clear picture on what these denialists really look like, right? They are the lay citizens, right? People who exist in every facet of society and all those things. They are minority, and then they are huge conspiracy theorists, right? They also believe that the state is actively pursuing them. The state doesn't want them to come out to the truth and all those things, right? What they also believe is that what they are saying is the truth in its purest form, right? Those are what climate change denialists do, right? And why we believe that when you actively criminalize these guys, it's a very, very terrible thing in the bid to be able to fight climate change. Because first of all, in criminalizing them, you give them a platform you give them a platform to be able to first of all legitimize their claims that state is directly is actively antagonizing them from coming out with the truth. What this means is that they then have people listening to them more, because when you give them a chance to mount defenses for themselves within court systems and all those things, this gives these people the chance to be able to propagate their ills and all those things, right? And you must be able to understand that we shouldn't give these people any room whatsoever to be able to propagate their harms, right? These guys didn't even show us how necessarily believers in climate change themselves do not contribute to to environmental degradation in itself, right? If they're supposed to prove that climate denialists are the main reason why the environment is changing and all those things, then they should have shown us how the counterfactual doesn't really destroy the environment, right? They didn't do that. We think that their work creates a bystander effect where people think that by mere fact of believing in climate change, you then solve the problem. And I believe that climate change exists, but I'm still using a plastic water bottle. I don't think that those things fall flat in today's debate, right? But what you must also be able to understand is why we think their model doesn't solve the problem, right? Because we need very radical stances to be able to solve the kind of things that climate change has brought, right? Because it's a matter of agency. The world is degrading at a faster rate. There are polar ice caps melting and all those things. We think that focusing on a minute section like climate change deniers are very minute minority society. Focusing on them just give them a higher voice to be able to propagate their ills and all those things. We don't solve the problem, right? But in our world, we say go on radical stances by states, by bodies and all those things. Do not give them the choice to go green. Make them go green. Force them to go green. Why do we say this? Because we think that the idea of educating people to go green, educating people on why they need to go green and all those things have failed. We need very radical stances to ensure that the world exists for the future generations to come. Their world doesn't solve those things. It only just focus on very minute people that do not people that we shouldn't even necessarily focus on, right? But panel, why we think what does the radical stances we talk to you about really look like, right? So our radical stances are one, ensuring that companies whatsoever forcefully go green. It's a total overhaul of the entire system, right? And we don't care if it's expensive. We don't care if we will still go ahead to ensure that it is done, right? It means that forcing people to go green, forcing people to stop banning use of single-use plastics and all those things. It's a very hardcore stance. We think that their award doesn't really solve the problem in totality, right? But panel, what does their solve also mean, right? And why their award will fail in totality, right? Because their award creates a bystander effect, right? So what do we mean by the bystander effect? It creates the idea that by believing in the idea of climate change, I am actively solving the problem. Why we think that in itself is false, and why we think that in itself is false? Because there are people who vehemently believe that climate change exists, even with eco-friendly companies who believe that climate change exists, but they do not do things to go totally green. You still have companies like Tesla who cut corners to ensure that they get their lithium batteries and all those things. You still have companies like Nike who believe that who believe that climate change exists, but do not do the necessary to ensure that the environment is sustainable. Their world doesn't account for those bystanders. We think that it's very, very terrible, right? But why is this important? Because the bystanders consist of a very big, a huge chunk of the population of the world, right? It means that these people believe that it exists, but they don't necessarily do anything to do this, right? But what these guys also fail to understand is when they tell us about denial, right? They try to paint a picture where when you know they try to put the picture, especially when Andrews comes to tell you that within developing worlds and all those things, there are tangible denials and all those things. Why it is false? Because these people in these instances are more likely to do things for their survival, right? It's either they know nothing about it in totality, right, or they are just doing things just for their survival. It also means that the states within this, they have no incentive whatsoever to oblige to force people, because they get corporations and all those things coming foreign direct investments and all those things. Their word doesn't really solve the problem, right? But what we think we should prioritize in today's debate is what we told, right? So we think that principally, right? We are justified because we think that principally we are justified to take the same sort of action that industrialists have used to rid the environment of its goods, right? We think that's a very, very terrible. We think that's a very, very terrible thing to sit aloof and say, oh, it is your choice to go green. We think that's a very, very terrible thing, right? But we also think that to the point at which human survival, the survival instinct of humans has been triggered, we think that we should go all out to ensure that the right things are done, right? We think that our word is one that solves the problem, because our word is a very radical one. Our word is one that focuses on the people, right? But we also think that look, when you are judging the debate, you should be able to judge the debate on who best solves the problem of climate change, who focuses more on the people, who focuses more on the right people, right? So, these guys say, well, let us focus on corporations. We've already proven to you how necessarily corporations do not form part of climate change denialists, right? At best, you have companies fronting the idea that they are green, but in actuality, they are not green, right? They tell us that let's focus on developing worlds and all those things. We say no, because you should be able to you should look at it on a global front, because it's a global problem, right? In our world, they're able to solve those things, right? But they say let us actively go against people within developing worlds who are just trying to live their daily lives, who don't have any idea of climate change and all those things. We think their word is a flawed one, right? But we think that what you judge is on urgency, solvency, and on the impracticality of these guys' models, right? Because we've agreed that the urgency exists. All the harms that these guys talk about with climate change existing and all those things, we consider those things. We think that we need to be able to take the right measures to be able to ensure that climate change is fully raised.
Radicalism about ensuring that parliamentarians take a policy equally exists in our world. Understand? Why? Because what this criminalization looks like is exactly being able to take these parliamentarians to take decisions. But to better strengthen their cause of criminalization, you need to make sure people believe in the concept that these things actually do not exist, and that is how you are able to pursue better the working towards the green ecology, that the green statehood and all that these guys believe in. So we concede that in status quo already governments are pursuing policies that are towards green, that are towards people going green. But the problem is that we do not have mechanisms to be able to further strengthen the concept that climate change exists and we are supposed to fight a cause against it. Understand this clarity. We solve their problems better by education, by making people believe in this concept. That is how we better conscientize people to come against climate change and to better do things Kojo tells you about choosing between using a coal and using something that goes against it. The basic facet is that states need to take a stance to be able to go against the fact that climate change does not exist. Why? Because Kojo tells you essentially that when you take such an active stance, we don't care whether climate change people believe it exists or not. What we care about is to pursue the action of making people believe that it does exist, whether it is false or true. We want them to believe in that. Why? Because of what Kojo analyzes to you about survival and all that. So all these things they preach in their world is one you should understand that it already exists in status quo. But to better strengthen the cause of parliamentarians taking the decisions for people to be conscientized and working towards them. Because even if you educate them and they still don't have that conscientization, they'll still go back and then pollute the environment and climate change will still exist whatsoever. Even if you do all those things and then that strengthening of concept doesn't exist, you don't get the utility they want to get. So we better achieve all their utilities through the strengthening of the concept that Kojo tells you, in the universal jurisdiction that OG doesn't constitute, right? But let's start it. Guys, relax, okay. So essential things Kojo tells you that engages each of the three sides, right? Kojo tells you about this debate being about the denial of climate change. What essentially these two guys argue is about what the causes of what climate change is and why we should go against the cause of climate change. And then these guys also trying to get a solvency by saying if you go against these causes, then you are being taking a radical approach and all that. Kojo tells you essentially that the debate is about the denial of climate change. Why? Because the nature of people who deny climate change are one, people who are authors and have large audience and are engaged audience in their world. Two, people who are corporate people, companies, and then they want their selfish interest. Selfishness runs through these guys. Even if these guys are people who already believe in it. The reason why we think that it is necessary that you counter you criminalize the denial is what Kojo tells you about the issue of saying how the nature of climate change and how it is possible to cause an extinction of every single human being. Because Kojo analyzes you on the state level, how it is necessary for the state to stand firm on taking a directive that will protect its citizens. Because at the end of the day, you don't necessarily go by saying we are going against the causes of climate change. Because even if you go against the cause of climate change and people are not conscientized to believe that climate change actually exists, they know what towards it. You rather solve the cause of climate change by starting by the conscientization and the education through the conscientization by the state taking an active firm. But the next thing that Kojo analyzes to you is to make you understand about the audience that these guys are so concerned about. So Kojo tells you two things. If we criminalize, take an active course of prosecution, two things, we win or we lose. If we lose in the worst case scenario, Kojo analyzes to show you how essentially the prosecution process is one that reveals a lot of facts and figures. Two, these guys are going to waste a lot of resources that will cripple them from pursuing their causes. On the fact of figures, this is a better way of making evidence and conscientizing people to know what the harms are in society. But secondly, on decrippling these people, these guys are selfish in nature, and then we want to decripple them from pursuing their selfish interest of preaching and propagating what is existent in status quo, that climate change doesn't exist and let's pursue. Because we think that even though they might believe that climate change exists, they say it does not exist because of the profit they want to gain and their audience, right? But next up, even if the other flip side is, what if we win? If we win, Kojo tells you we incapacitate these people. How is that necessary? Understanding the characterization of audience. These guys are people who have audience in society. So they have followership and all. So the best argument they could have run is to say that there will be mass escalation from this audience against these people. But the response to that is this. You break the fabric of socialization between the person and then its followership when you imprison him or incapacitate him. What does that mean? It means that the state then has more time to conscientize the public because those people who are preaching the false narratives have been taken out. So you have more time to conscientize people. Why is this true? Analogy of torture. A torture is able to re-socialize the person is torturing with time. It means that if state has the ability to incapacitate these guys and conscientize, educate people with the issues, then you know that you have won, and then people are going to believe in the. And what it also means to the people is that these guys are also rehabilitated to then come and believe in the fact that yes, it is actually possible. But the reason why they will even believe into it is because most of them pretend they don't believe in, but then when they go to the heart, the deterrence factor, they're able to be rehabilitated and they don't go back to the crimes. But why essentially do we win this debate today? OG can't win this debate and OO can't. Why? OG essentially first. OG limits this debate to developing nations. These guys say developed nation. A universal jurisdiction is necessary in this conscientization. Why? Because Kojo analyzes to you how climate change transcends and does not care about border. What it means is that if you criminalize just in Ghana, in Nigeria, there are people in Mexico who are authors and will preach this. Social media and globalization has made it simple in such a way that I can access that. So criminalization in Ghana is arbitrary and you can't even achieve it. Kojo gives you a better metric of a universal jurisdiction of this criminalization because at the end of the day, when you all come and tell you about UN and all that, you solve the problem. But these guys say in developed states, we think that everybody is going to be prone to climate change whatsoever. So we need a collective action of ensuring that the narrative that climate change exists is preached against, and then we solve the problem of climate change by attacking the concept and not just by jumping to the causes. We solve all their problems in these debates.
Because he doesn't understand what brain proposes as an alternative, right? In Brain's world, he doesn't say let's criminalize it or anything like that. He says that we believe there is an agency that exists, right? So even in the world where we even believe everything that these guys say, which we don't, we think criminalizing is not enough. There should be an outright ban, right? This is why. The act of denial is more psychological than like physical, right? That means that it has to do with psychological and mental perceptions that people have, right? What you do when you criminalize, like you take them to trial, you incarcerate them, it's just that you restrict them like physically. Even in the case where we believe that denialists are equal to people that perpetrate the acts of causing climate change, right? When you take them, like when you incarcerate them, you just like restrict them physically. When they come out after serving the time that you give them, be it 5 years, 10 years, there is nothing that goes to say they would have reformed and would now believe that climate change is something that exists. They will still be denialists. We don't want to leave that to chance. Let's just force them. That is why Brain tells you that we are tired of leaving things to chance. We are tired of telling them there's an alternative. You can decide to go green. Like panel, like criminalizing it basically says we are putting measures in place to punish you. There still exists the choice of you doing it. So like it's a case of do it and let's punish you. Our world says we force you, we ban it. Like we shut down these companies completely, right? So there isn't that like choice that do it and then be punished. We think you should stop them mandatorily. Brain tells you we are tired of a world where there exists choice. We are tired of a world where these people have new ways to do what they want. We think we should put more drastic measures in place because this is a topic we are tired of discussing. We don't want this to exist. What Brain tells you necessarily is that we should not do things like normal tax cuts, like incentivizing companies to go green and all those things. We should heavily invest in green tech instead, right? Like the main reason why denialists exist is because there is a problem. That problem is climate change. There is discourse. People think it exists. People think it's not true. The only way to solve the problem of the existence of these denialists, right, is to make sure that we solve the problem of climate change. We show you how these people's if we solve climate change and it's no longer a problem that exists, or if we mitigate it, there's 6 minutes, please. There is no longer a world where we are going to have discourse about whether it exists or not because necessarily the problem has been solved, right? That is why Brain tells you that these guys criminalizing doesn't solve it. It just exacerbates the situation. We don't think there should be a solution that makes the problem worse. We think we should go with CEO's world that says let's put an outright stop to it. Let's mandate companies to go green or lose their shut them down, right? So moving on, right? OG says that companies, these companies that move are denialists and all these things, right? People in these developing countries, if we were to go with OG's film, people in these developing countries are not denialists. They do not think it doesn't exist. Some of them don't know about it. But even those that do prioritize on any day survival and existence over, they prioritize putting food on the table at the end of the day, right? That is why someone could believe in climate change and still engage in galamsey, because he thinks that because I'm in a developing country, our economy is not so strong, I need to focus on what to do to feed my family at the end of the day, right? That is what they prioritize. They are not denialists. That is why the only reason Andrews would be able to equate denialists to people that perpetrate the act is if he's able to prove that people that believe in climate change are not people do not contribute in any way to the problem of climate change, right? They don't do that. We think OG falls flat in today's debate, right? More to that, right? These guys, 50 minutes, OG. Where is it? So OG also says that they try to say that there is non-verbal denial and why we cannot say there is non-verbal and physical denial, right? I proved to you how this denial is more something that is psychological, because it depends on this denial comes about because of the perception that these people have about their states, right? So they feel like their states are known for telling them things that make them more amenable to their ways. They think states deceive them, right? That is why they would believe in denial in the first place. It is more a mental and psychological construct than something that is physical. That is why anything that we put in place to restrict them physically doesn't solve the problem. It just exacerbates it, because even in the case where you take them to trial, that is why Brain asked the POI about, are we going to allow them to mount a defense? It's not about them winning the trial or not, right? It's about them having a legitimate platform to say, we were right. Government is trying to clamp down on us completely, right? And let the world be here. Something that is as dicey as climate change is something that if it should go to trial, is going to get a lot of traction. It's going to get a lot of people listening, right? We think on any day, what state in trying to protect this perpetuity should not do is to give these guys a legitimate platform to forward their ideas, right? That is what we are against. We do not want a situation where we leave it to chance, we go to trial, or we allow them to forward their ideas, right? We don't think that is something that should happen on any day, right? Before I go on.
So we argue rehabilitation and how the witnesses that come about to make people buy more into the government so than these people. But most importantly, it's literally a parliamentary system. You don't show up when we do this thing, you cannot do what exists in your world. It's a parliamentary system.
Panel. our world is mostly against leaving anything to chance, right? Like these guys talk about how we are going to go to trial, like there are going to be evidences. See, our problem is not with like the denialists winning the trial or losing the trial. Our problem is with how public it goes, like how much you give them a ground to do it. They talk about rehabilitation, like they preach a world where rehabilitation is 100% assured after incarceration, right? Like that is not what happens, right? That is why we feel we shouldn't leave anything to chance. There shouldn't be a world where like we decide that, oh, let's try it, like let's incarcerate them, and then like after they come out, we see if they solve the problem. They talk about like losing resources, like all those things don't fly in today's days, right? Before I go on, opening.
So essentially, your team joins the government to support criminalization by panel, because in parliament it's a means of criminalization.
So panel, these guys' criminalization talks about incarceration or like exiling people, right? Like our world says shuts down companies that like even do like 20 to 30% contribution on the carbon footprint, shuts these guys down, invest more in green tech, do not give them the chance, see panel, our world feels like there has been so many discussion about like climate change and its existence, right? These guys have had the chance to decide whether they want to stop it or not. We think we've gotten to a point where we should shut them down immediately, right? That is what we want from closing opposition. We do not want a world where we say let's criminalize and incarcerate them, because that's the framework that these guys said, that let's incarcerate them. We don't want a world where we give them the chance that if you do it, we are going to put you in prison, right? We think we should just shut them down immediately and invest heavily in green tech. We don't join the government. We propose a better alternative, an alternative that actually works, that is radical, that is drastic, that solves the problem, right? That is why we win from closing opposition. Like panel, we basically prove to you how denialists are not equal to people that perpetrate the acts, because necessarily we have believers that also perpetrate the acts. Like someone that's like uses charcoal to cook in the house and all those things, right? I could be a believer, like Brain says, he uses plastic bottle. That doesn't mean he doesn't believe in climate change, but he's still perpetrating the action. What you do in their world is you allow people to believe that the moment I believe, whatever I do doesn't cause climate change. We don't want that world. We want a world where we feel people should put in more to solve the problem of climate change. You only get that from closing opposition. Proud to oppose.
Acheampong.